So I have the privilege and the burden of being the last person. And I was getting kind of, I don't know if Monica intended it, but she looked like giving quite stern looks my direction. So I... With reason. So I come at this, I'll try and be brief. You'll note that I'm one of the only people without prepared remarks, but that's also the privilege. It's dangerous, but it's also the privilege of going last. So I want to just give you a sense. I'm a practicing scientist. So I'm an evolutionary biologist. It's what I do. We are all part, those of us who are practicing scientists are part of a global science knowledge world, just by virtue of the way in which we do our work. And we've heard, you'd be forgiven for wanting to sort of throw yourself out of the 12th floor here after perhaps some of Paul's and Errol's comments. So let me try and situate my perspective in the community from about which I'm speaking are scientists. And what we see, and what I see is some of the brighter lights moving forward. And so we'll try and end on a positive note. We'll start with something that's maybe not so bright, but let's just face it, we're dealing in a world, in addition to all the institutional and political challenges, we're dealing in a world where problems of a political and scientific nature are transnational by nature. Okay, I'm thinking about antimicrobial resistance and the emergence of re-emergence and emergence of infectious disease like Zika, SARS, whatever. Issues around migration, climate change. The other aspect of these issues is, of course, they can be very contentious, where evidence and ideology are often at odds. Perhaps not so much with antimicrobial resistance, but certainly with issues around climate change and migration. That said, and I'm not so far out of my junior scientist years as to be too out of touch, I hope, with that community. I want to talk about the community of researchers that is coming up into the system and give you a flavor of how they're, two aspects really of what they're like. First of all, they're incredibly mobile. They're much more mobile than anybody has ever been before. They're very willing to pick up and go wherever the money and the interesting work is. They're also rather agnostic to things like fundamental, basic, applied research. It could care less, really. I mean, it's just interesting questions. And the third thing is they're very engaged and looking for ways to become more engaged. And by engaged, I mean not just doing the bench work and staying behind, if you like, behind the proverbial curtain of the Wizard of Oz, but actually getting their science out there and talking to people and doing work that is more engaged with communities, both locally and internationally. And so in that light, I want to point out three brighter lights and opportunities that I see on the horizon. One are new avenues for science diplomacy. And I'll just briefly tell you about an organization that I've been involved with for a few years now called the Global Young Academy, which is an academy, meaning a curated, selected group of individuals from around the world who are, young means in this case within 10 years of getting their PhD. So I am no longer a member, I am an alumnus. You can't be young forever. You clock out after about 5 years. But this is an interesting organization. It has 200 individuals are identified at any one time. So roughly 25 to 35 get appointed each year from all disciplines in research. And that means both the natural sciences as well as the humanities and social sciences. And from around the world, the membership of 200 individuals includes representatives from around 50 countries at any one time. That's really incredibly diverse. And working in that space, I was its co-chair for 2 years, teaches you an incredible amount about cultural sensitivity, about communication skills, and I'd like to say that some of these lessons are learned most immediately as you're trying to find your way from the airport to the hotel or the conference room, right? Just simply moving people around the world and having them talk to other people from around the world is an incredibly valuable experience. The other in that science diplomacy, and it's incredible for the relationships you build, but I'd like to say with the Global Young Academy that this is your best bet on the next generation of global science leadership. So watch that space. The International Network for Government Science Advice is also interesting in this regard. They've been conducting for the past few years workshops on building capacity around advice in the space between science and decision-making, evidence and decision-making, and I think that's a place to watch as well. Second, I think that it's really important to equip researchers to lead, both locally and globally. And this is something that is remarkably within my own science community not really talked about very much, because the assumption is if you're an excellent scientist, you're a leader. And that's true to a degree. You're an academic and intellectual leader. But leading people, either locally or globally, is a very different thing. And so I'd like to flag for you a couple of things. The GYA is one, the Global Young Academy is one space where that's starting to happen. But the other are organizations like the Leopold Leadership Program, run out of Stanford University, which was started about 20 years ago by Jane Lubchenco and others, who's a former director of NOAA in the United States, to cultivate academic leaders who are capable of and willing to participate in conversations with decision makers and with the public, including the former host of The Daily Show, Jon Stewart, for some of them. There's a similar program in Africa called the African Science Leadership Program, run out of the University of Pretoria, which I've been involved with for a number of years. And there's actually many others that are growing in this space. And I think this is an incredibly valuable opportunity, because it's about giving scientists an opportunity to engage more directly in some of these conversations that are going on globally. The last is sort of and encourage everyone in whatever capacity, and especially those in leadership roles, to support research and engagement more broadly. And I'd point to organizations like Future Earth, whose world headquarters are in Montreal, who still in experimental phase, to be sure, but are developing these knowledge to action networks where knowledge creation is happening, is explicitly being done in the context of communities and with an eye to what's going on the ground. I think citizen science is an especially interesting space, and I just came from a discussion at the l'Académie Française in Paris a week and a half ago, where this will be the topic of the G7 statement from the academies to the G7 leaders next year. Citizen science is a very broad term that can mean a bunch of different things, but it could mean anything from patient-driven research in medicine or patient-informed research in medicine. It can mean playing video games to solve scientific problems, and there's a Jerome Waldspiel from McGill has developed an app basically to help citizens help researchers do genome alignments. You can go play it at the Science and Tech Museum. And there's also a growing space in areas like synthetic biology around researchers for hire. So these are individuals who are working outside of universities, industry, or government, and are basically saying, you tell me what you want. You want a blue rose? I'll do it for you. So these are all, there's some positives and negatives in this space, but I think it's an interesting space to watch. And the last thing around engagement, I noticed some of my friends and colleagues from MyTax, April, hello, who's a huge proponent of different kinds of engagement. Science slams, I think, is one of the most important. There are many young researchers are looking for ways to get their work out there. On my part, I'm delighted to be hosting for the next 2 years an embedded journalist who will be working alongside a Banting postdoctoral fellow in my lab and blogging about her experiences with this postdoctoral fellow and doing research of her own. And you can find, her name's Jessa Gamble, you can find her work at lastwordonnothing.com, which is a quote from Victor Hugo. Science has the first word on everything and the last word on nothing. So I think there's some bright lights in terms of, these are globally connected individuals and organizations. And I think that there is more hope than perhaps our first cadre of speakers might have led us to believe. And so I'm happy to discuss more in the discussion. Thanks.